Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Is there anyone that would like to make a public comment? And also, everyone, please put some phones on side of the phone.
I'm Vicki Polito from 25242 Lakeview Drive. I'm going to try to go pretty fast because I know you guys have a lot on the agenda tonight. And if you need something from me after, some reiteration information, please don't hesitate to stop me. I looked at some emails from the past year or so, and something that concerned me. In May 15th of last year, there was this company, GUTS, that we've all heard about, that we sort of were contracted. So on May 15th, there's a back and forth of email about a confidentiality agreement, non-disclosure agreement from GUTS. On June 3rd, Garrett Peck ordered a bunch of hardware and asked for a rush install for mid-June. I get the feeling, my sense is that, because he believes he's a big IT guy, that when you're a hammer, or think you're a hammer, every problem looks like nails. So I think he was doing a lot of IT stuff at that time. In November, Doug Booth exchanged email with a man named John Stansel, who was the GUTS contact, regarding the install of something called SpectreSoft 360. SpectreSoft 360, I think it was for about 12 licenses or 12 PCs, is a spyware program whose tagline is monitor and track your employees at a park district. It's going to be put on employee computers in a silent install. There was back and forth in emails during this November time period about how to make sure employees wouldn't know this by being sure to do it off hours and rebooting their machines so they wouldn't see the logo for the software come up. And Doug Booth and Garrett Peck were the only people who had admin status to monitor this system. And later in December, Paul Darren, who was also involved in this, was going to do this further throughout the district, so I'm not sure exactly how many licenses got installed. That's really the biggest problem I had with some of that. My real concern is also that, first of all, I'm very puzzled as to why would a park district purchase and implement spyware software for employee workstations? And secondly, what workstations and staff were targeted? There are back and forth emails where clearly Doug Booth supplied an Excel spreadsheet with a list of names of people whose machines should get this. And what information and data was maybe captured or tracked? Was it our finance data, HR data, resident info? How many tax dollars were used for this total? And is this over? The other last thing that I noticed was that on January 27th, late that afternoon, John Stansel tells Doug Booth in an email that he's disabled Garrett Peck's network account and also stopped the Spectre server. That was 4 days after Garrett Peck walked out. That's almost 4 full days of time when there was still network access given to somebody who left in a real quick hurry. I'd like to hear some information about what kind of things were secured, unsecured during that time period. Thanks very much. Bye.
Is there anyone else? Hello, board. I'm Michelle Kelly, 14907 South Portland, Plainfield. First of all, I want to say how exciting it has been to see the direction of the Park District in the last few months. And I think you all probably can see that too, but the numbers of people that have dwindled at the meetings, the concern seems to be going down. And hopefully some of the good things like the capital improvement presentation tonight will be wonderful. A year ago, the director didn't even know what a capital improvement plan was when it passed during the budget time. So this is really an exciting phase to see this kind of presentation. So thank you so much for going in that direction. At the same time, I hope we can close the book maybe on some of the negative things that have happened in the last year. But to do that, I think it's important to answer some of the questions that have still been out there and haven't been answered. So what I'd like to do is make a list of those questions, send them to the interim director, and try to get some of those answers so that we can, I guess, in essence, know what happened. Vicki brought up one thing, I hadn't even thought of that one, and there's a multiple of other ones that were questions brought during public opinion. Does that sound like something that could work?
Sure. Could you copy me to your list?
Yes.
I would suggest that we just send it to me, I'll make sure.
You'll send it down to the board. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Would anyone Next is the consent agenda. I need a motion to approve the consent agenda.
I'll make that motion.
Second.
No, second.
Okay, roll call.
Bludman,
Yes.
Newton, oh, sorry, here, Slawski, here, yes, Sykes.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, next is action items, seeking a motion to select an auditor for the district.
Later, make a motion.
I'll second. Is there any presentation or discussion?
You all have in front of you the memo staff prepared as it relates to the recommendation. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Roll call.
No.
Bludman,
Yes.
Slawski, yes, Sykes.
Yes.
Motion carries. Staff reports. Director of Finance and Human Resources.
Yes. What I'd like to do is I'll take that just for a second because we've got a presentation coming in just a few moments as it relates to the capital improvement plan. But as part of that this evening, I'm pleased to introduce two of our consultants that do a lot of work with the district and have done work with the district over the years. Steve Larson from Ellers and Associates. Many of you may know Steve, has done a number of bond sales with the district over the years. And our corporation counsel as it relates to bond sales is Linda Gibbons from the firm of Chapman and Cutler. And I thought it'd be good for them to come out this evening as we talk about capital so we can kind of bring subject matter full circle so the board has an understanding of the legal in and outs, the bonding authority the district has, and then how that ties into what I'll be doing as a bond presentation this evening as it relates to the next number of years that the district has. So we'll start with Steve this evening. And, we should have some handouts. There are some available for the audience. We'll get out to you if you're interested. Steve, thank you for all.
Thanks, Rich. Again, I'm Steve Larson, financial advisor for Ellers and Associates. Our office is in Wyoming, and we've been working with the district on bond issue matters about the last 20 years. And happy to be here tonight. I'm just going to start with an introduction, and then Linda Gibbons from Chapman Cutler is going to follow me, and then I'm going to follow her. And what we're going to try to do is give you a good orientation as to borrowing options that you have with respect to funding any kinds of capital improvements. We're just going to talk about capital improvement plans, and we're going to talk about how you can finance it. Of course, you can finance things on a pay-as-you-go basis. You know, you pay cash for projects, and you've been doing a lot of that over the years. And we're going to talk about some of the other methods that you can use. One of the handouts that you have is a blue sheet here. I'm just going to touch on this a little bit, and then I don't want to steal too much wind here from Linda. But this sheet shows you the bonds that you have outstanding for the district. And there's columns here, or there's 1 through 10, and you have an issue that was issued in 1999. Another one in 2009, and then an issue that was issued in 2010, which was a refunding on a 2000 issue that was a referendum-related issue for $5,925,000. And this shows you your principal and interest bond levies on a year-by-year basis. And it also shows you, so that's in columns 2, 3, and 4, and then column 5 shows your total bond levies. The total bond levy for 13 is $865,198. It's just above the line there. Your EAV, or your equalized assessed valuation, that's your volume taxable valuation of the Park District, is $2.2 billion. And your bond tax rate, we have various tax rates, but the bond portion of the tax rate is about 0.385. And that amounts to about $36 for a family that owns a $300,000 home. The other two columns show information about what we call a debt service extension base and limited bonds, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So this is, and then at the bottom left shows information about your debt limit. You can see your overall debt margin or ability to issue debt is about $60 million. You have lots of ability to issue debt if you have to. And And the right side, under columns 9 and 10, talk about abilities to issue what we call non-referendum limited bonds. But we're also going to be talking about other kinds of debt besides a limited bond, which is and then a referendum bond. We're going to be talking about debt certificates and alternate bonds, which are another vehicle for which you could issue debt, fund capital projects. And there's a lot of nuances to all this stuff, and hopefully we'll give you some insight tonight about that. I'm going to hand this over to Linda, and then we'll come back to me and we'll field questions and hopefully get your answers.
Good evening. What I thought we would do tonight is we started off with Steve giving you an overview on that blue sheet of the debt that you have already issued and that is on your books. I'm going to talk about the various borrowing options that are available to you as a legal matter, and then we'll come back to Steve to talk about, of those options, which ones might fit your particular situation the best. So you should have a handout with these PowerPoint slides, and I'd like to start actually with page 3. There's more in the PowerPoint slides that we're actually going to cover tonight. I can guarantee I would put you all to sleep if we covered everything. So what I want to do is hit the high points. On page 3 are the 6 borrowing options that are available to you under Illinois law. One of them, the very first one, requires a direct referendum. The other 5 options do not require a referendum. So let's start first talking about page 4. Whatever kind of debt you issue, we need to make sure that it falls within your debt limit. And as Steve pointed out on the blue sheet, you have plenty of room in your overall debt limit to issue up to about $60 million worth of bonds. So that your debt limit is not going to be a constraining factor. So then going to page 5, we talk about general obligation referendum bonds. These are bonds for which you go to referendum on a designated election date and ask the voters for the approval for the issuance of bonds to pay for various capital projects. The ballot proposition will have 2 key points for the voters to vote on. The first is the maximum amount of bonds that you're asking for approval for, and then secondly, a description of the projects that you will be using the bond proceeds to pay for. The maximum maturity of those bonds is 25 years, so that doesn't mean that you have to keep them outstanding for 25 years, that is just the maximum. And these bonds are used to pay for various capital projects: land acquisition, capital improvements, buildings, building improvements, equipment, whatever capital expenditures you want to pay for that relate to park improvements. So that's the one option that would require a direct referendum. And at the bottom of that page, you note that the referendum is good for 5 years. So that doesn't mean that if the voters approve this referendum, that doesn't mean you have to issue all the bonds right away. You have 5 years after the date of the referendum to issue those bonds. Okay? Okay, non-referendum bonds. These do not require any voter approval. They are authorized under tax caps, but the amount that you can levy each year to pay those bonds is limited to your debt service extension base. And you have some of those bonds outstanding. On your blue sheet, Steve sets forth the amount of your debt service extension base and how much room might be available in it. So before you issue these bonds, you are required to hold a public hearing that is purely advisory. As I say to people, 500 people can show up at the public hearing with placards and bullhorns. All you have to do is listen to them. Once you close the public hearing, you can proceed with the issuance of the bond. So there's no direct referendum for these bonds, but there is a public hearing requirement. Again, these have to mature within 25 years, and they can be issued like voter-approved bonds for any capital projects. Okay, any questions so far? So those are your basic referendum and non-referendum bonds. Okay, now things get a little more interesting or complicated. Another option for you, and this has been in the park code for many, many years, is the ability to issue what are called debt certificates. These are non-referendum obligations. They do not require a public hearing, and there isn't any sort of voter approval required for them. They have to be issued within your overall 2.875% debt limit. Their maximum maturity is 20 years, and they are payable from your general operating funds. Unlike bonds that have a separate property tax levy to pay them, debt certificates are payable. There's no new tax that comes from debt certificates. So what I tell my clients all the time is, before you embark on debt certificates, you have to know how you're going to pay for them. You have to be able to, you have to look at your budget and say, we are earmarking X amount of dollars out of our general operating funds each year to pay for this debt. Okay? So that becomes a very important aspect of your budgeting process to make sure that you have sufficient funds available to pay this debt. Now, having said that, there is a way to convert these debt certificates that don't have a separate property tax levy into debt that does have a property tax levy. If you look at the last bullet point on slide 7, it says principal and interest are often retired by annual rollover non-referendum limited bonds. So what park districts frequently do is issue these debt certificates, again, payable from your general operating funds, but then each year you would issue non-referendum bonds payable from a separate property tax levy, and the proceeds of those bonds would be used to pay this debt. So that is a way to convert this debt from an operating fund obligation into a separate debt service levy obligation. And my clients will do this every year. So if you have a principal and interest payment coming up on your debt certificates on December 1, in November you would issue these non-referendum bonds, and the money from that bond issue would be used to make that December 1 payment. And you do that every year. That's why they're called rollover bonds. So you take the debt and you roll it onto the property tax levy every year. Okay? Any questions on that? Next page. A similar type of instrument that also typically relies on this rollover bond concept is the issuance of alternate bonds. Alternate bonds are bonds payable from a separate property tax levy. But under the statute, there is no expectation that that levy will ever be used. Instead, you are expected to use some sort of revenue source to pay those bonds. Either operating fund monies, like debt certificates, or these rollover bonds, again, can be used as your revenue source to make the payment on these alternate bonds. These bonds can go out 40 years, so they are the longest maturity that you could possibly have. This type of instrument is subject to the public hearing requirement, as well as something that is called a backdoor referendum. Keep in mind that with debt certificates that we talked about a minute ago, all you do is issue them. No public hearing required, no direct referendum, no real taxpayer input for the issuance of debt certificates. For alternate bonds, you are required to go through a petition period. And what that means is at the start of the process, you adopt an ordinance setting forth your intent to issue these bonds. Notice of that intent is then published in your local newspaper, and you wait 30 days. If 7.5% of the registered voters do not petition you objecting to the issuance of these bonds, then you can proceed with a bond issue. If those petitions are filed and they are valid petitions, then the process stops and you go to referendum. Okay? So that's why it's called a backdoor referendum. You get on the ballot through the back door of the petition process rather than putting the question directly on the ballot yourselves. Okay? Okay, next page. I tell my clients, and I think Steve will concur with this, if you're looking at the issuance of alternate bonds, you should also be looking at debt certificates. And this chart here compares the two different types of obligations. They're very similar, but they have some distinct differences. The similarity is that usually these annual non-referendum rollover bonds are used to make the payments on both debt certificates and alternate bonds. But with alternate bonds, they are, if that revenue source were ever insufficient to pay the alternate bonds, then the property tax that's put in place to pay those bonds would be extended. With debt certificates, again, it's a general operating fund obligation, no separate property tax. But this chart, which you can study in your leisure, sort of sets out the differences between debt certificates and alternate bonds. Revenue bonds, I put in your materials, no one ever issues them anymore. These are bonds that are payable solely from the revenues of the facility that you're financing, such as golf course revenues for a golf course, swimming pool revenues for a swimming pool. Because of the ability to issue alternate bonds payable from a revenue source with a backup property tax pledge, we have not seen a traditional revenue bond issue done in this state in probably 20, 25 years. And the reason is because they are revenue obligations payable solely from the revenues of an enterprise, investors don't consider them to be very secure. There have been defaults on that type of obligation in various parts of the state. So it is an option for you, but not one that anyone really considers or puts on the table any longer. So that's it for your various options. Any questions? Thank you. Steve?
Okay. Rich, did you tell them there will be a test after this?
Even if we're not supposed to say that. I was just, it was going to be a pop quiz.
All right, let's put this into practice and see what your abilities are. So there's another handout that's in the bottom, or in the
Packet.
Anyway, I'm going to work from this one, and we'll talk about some of your abilities as you get from this. All right, on the top there, and this, of course, is all draft. It says debt certificates or GEO alternate revenue source bonds. So they're very similar, and so the example I'm giving here in this example is that you take $200,000 out of you designate $200,000 out of your rec fund or your general fund, revenue that's already coming in through the property tax or user fees, that sort of thing. You say, okay, we're going to designate $200,000 that we already have coming into us on a regular basis, and we're going to say this is for debt service, for future debt service. And so how much can we borrow with a $200,000 payment? Just like if you're doing a mortgage, how much could I do for $200,000? And what I've done here is showed you what it would be for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and 20 years. And the interest rates on these, and I didn't put those in here, but we have in the current market, we have an upward sloping yield curve. In other words, rates start at about 0.15% for 1 year, and go on up to maybe, for your district, go up to maybe 4% for 20 years. Now, you're a AA rated issuer. You have a AA rating in Standard & Poor's. The highest possible rating is AAA, so you're a notch or two below the highest possible rating. So that helps a lot because it helps you sell your debt at very low interest rates. So this assumes those kinds of things, assumes a AA rated issue. So you could borrow, and the reason that you might want to do something like this, instead of doing projects and pay as you go with cash every year, you might want to do a little larger project. Maybe it's a $2 million project or a $3 million project. And if you want to get it done all at once, you may have to borrow and pay for it that way. So this shows an example of if you amortize it over 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and 20 years, and how much you could borrow with a $200,000 revenue stream, okay, from your general fund and rec fund. About $1 million for 5 years, $1,750,000 for 10, 2.4 for 15, and 2.9 for 20 years. So you can get a lot of bang for your buck with $200,000. Now, you could use $400,000, $100,000, whatever. But part of it is working, and we can work with you on this. And you're going to get a capital improvement plan after our presentation, and you got to figure out how are we going to fund these capital improvements and capital replacements over the next 5 to 20 years. And so you need to put a plan in place, and part of that is cash, cash on a regular basis, maybe existing fund balances. But the other part is borrowing with your debt certificate, limited bonds, or even maybe a referendum bond. So, anybody have any questions on that debt certificate alternate bond? All right. The next one is GO limited tax bonds, and that method revolves around what we call your debt service extension base. Now, on the blue sheet here, in on column 9, that shows your debt service extension base. It's currently, as of 2014, it's $261,537. What that means is that's the total amount of principal and interest that you can pay in any 1 year under this particular authority. And the next column shows the amount of margin or availability to issue debt under this particular authority. See, in columns 2 and 3, you already have limited bonds. There were limited tax bonds that are under the debt service extension base. So we add those up and subtract it from the debt service extension base, and it leaves the margin in column 10, or the ability. And so when I'm figuring out how much you can issue, I'm looking at this column in column 10 to see what your ability is in any 1 year. And it's not big. Back in the tax cap came into place in 1991, and then limited bond, and in 1991, it wiped out the ability to issue non-referendum bonds. And then that was reinstated in 1994, and what the legislature did was that any non-referendum bonds you had on the books at that particular time, the levy you had on the books, that was going to serve as your debt service extension base. So you had no pre-planning or ability to plan for that as a park district, and you happen to have about, I think it was 230,000 or something that was on the books.
This is what it was.
Yeah. And some park districts had $1 million or $2 million on the books, and some park districts and school districts, covered both, had nothing. And if you had nothing, that means you will not have any ability to issue what we call non-referendum limited tax bonds. So it was all kind of if you were not issuing debt, you were penalized, for it. So anyway, that's where that comes from. And the GO limited tax bonds, it shows you if you issue bonds over a 5-year period, you could issue about $368,000 right now. For was over 10 years, he issued it today, 10 years, about $690,000.